This is lecture one, part two. In the first part of this lecture, we looked at definitions of social welfare policy, and we adopted Donito's definition of social welfare policy. We looked at examples of different programs that might fall within our definition of social welfare policy. We gave examples there. And then we looked at different ways to classify all the different social policies that are out there. We looked at classification based on eligibility criteria, classification based on the type of service that's offered. And then we were looking at justifications for why we study social policy in a social work program. And so to that end, we were looking at definitions of social justice. We were trying to promote social justice to the best of our ability. And so, which begged the question of what exactly is social justice. And to that end, we're looking at Amanda Baruch, a textbook by Amanda Baruch. This is a textbook apart from your Donito textbook, where she outlines different philosophical approaches to defining social justice. And there are various approaches, spanning Marxist approaches, oligarchist approaches, and such. But we just look at two of these approaches, and that's a libertarian approach to defining social justice, and then a liberal approach to defining social justice. Just a little bit of a heads up here. When we're looking at these definitions, I think it's going to be easier for you to understand these conceptions if you consider social justice as an allocated matter. So we're looking at social justice broadly in terms of the question of what's a fair or equitable allocation of resources in a given society. That's the fundamental question that we're trying to answer here in terms of what exactly is social justice. We're not looking at a more micro view of social justice or human rights or what's a fair manner of interacting with other individuals. We're not looking at that type of social justice, more of a broader approach to defining social justice. So keep that in mind as we move through these various definitions. So first, we look at the libertarian conception of social justice. And for me, when I look at the term libertarian, the first thing that jumps out at me is the word liberty. So for libertarian, there's an emphasis on liberty over equality. Liberty is emphasized, so inequality is acceptable to the libertarian. In fact, that's the price that we pay for the freedoms that we enjoy. And so when we're talking about liberty or freedom for that matter, there's lots of deeper philosophical traditions that define those terms separately. And without getting into those definitions, by liberty, we're just talking about freedom from government intervention. Right? So for libertarian, typically, libertarians will oppose government intervention. So things like affirmative action, government efforts to redress past injustices, or excessive taxation. Libertarians might oppose excessive taxes because there's that underlying emphasis on liberty over equality. And so one example of a libertarian approach to defining social justice comes from Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick is defining social justice in terms of outcomes and processes. And so he says that you need to look at the processes, not necessarily the outcomes. He's accepting of unequal distribution of resources in terms of the outcomes, but he says to judge fairness or equity, you have to look at the process by which people acquired their property. And so it requires us to look at the history of transactions of people who acquired their property and who may have more resources than another. So if we're looking at someone like Donald Trump and the unequal distribution of resources that are inherent in our society, if people like Donald Trump, for example, if they acquired their property fairly or equitably, when we look at the history of transactions, then that's an equitable or just distribution of resources according to Robert Nozick. And so the emphasis there is in looking at the processes by which people acquired their property. If that was in fact fair, then an unequal distribution is acceptable to Robert Nozick. Next, we move to the liberal conception of social justice, and we look at two different strands of thinking here. And one comes from John Rawls. That's a contractual approach, the Rawlsian notion of social justice. And then we have a John Stuart Mill approach to defining social justice. It's the utilitarian approach. Two different schools of thought within the liberal thinking about social justice. So first, we look at John Rawls. If you're interested in this line of reasoning, I would suggest you look at his book called A Theory of Justice. 500 plus pages of dense reading, philosophical reading about notions of social justice and such. But we're sort of glossing over this stuff very quickly. But if, in a nutshell, if you're looking at his line of reasoning, he says, take yourself outside of the current context. So in the current context, under all the laws that we currently live by, in terms of distribution of resources, take yourself out of that context, he says, and put yourself in a hypothetical world where you don't know your place in that society. You don't know your relative standing. You don't know if you have more resources or fewer resources than the person next to you. If you put yourself behind this veil of ignorance, and the operative terms there, we're talking about a veil of ignorance. If you put yourself behind that veil, he says, if you ask yourself, what sort of distribution rules would you want in that type of society? Recall that we've taken ourselves out of the current situation in which we're living into this hypothetical world without any laws in place. What sort of distribution rules would you want? And he says that you would rationally choose distribution rules that favor the least well off because you don't know if you're better off than the person next to you. You don't know if you're worse off than the person next to you in terms of the allocation of resources. And by resources, I'm talking not just about income, but whether or not you have better human capital, whether you're better looking than the person next to you, all types of resources. You don't know your standing, and in that type of society, you would choose distribution rules that favor the least well off because you might be among those who are in fact the least well off. And so he promotes the notion of a social minimum, that we should have a social minimum in our society below which no one should be allowed to fall. But there's a catch here. If you set that social minimum too high, it might be sacrificing the work incentive. So people would have less incentive to work hard if everyone has an equal distribution of resources. What's the incentive to work hard if I'm working twice as hard as the person next to me, but in the end, the allocation is in fact the same for me and my neighbor? And so he says you want to set that minimum as high as possible without sacrificing. We want to get it as high as possible without sacrificing the work incentive or efficiency. And so that's the John Rawls approach. And then finally, we have the utilitarian approach to defining social justice. This comes from John Stuart Mill. And so this is a precursor to modern notions of social justice and what's an equitable or efficient allocation of resources. And I want to direct your attention to the modern approach to defining social justice, and that's in terms of Pareto efficiency. We have a just allocation of resources when we have Pareto efficiency. And by Pareto efficiency, Pareto is just the name of a person who came up with this idea, a social scientist who came up with this idea of efficient allocations. And one illustration that I can give you in terms of an equitable, or efficient, I should say, an efficient allocation of resources is if you have two people, if you have a simple society, you have Jack and Jill, for example, and you have $1,000 worth of resources to allocate in that society. And let's say you give $300 to Jack and then $500 to Jill. That would be considered an inefficient allocation of resources because it's possible to make at least one person better off without making the other person worse off. For example, I could give an additional $100 because I have $1,000 to allocate. I could give an additional $100 to Jill, which would place her at $600 and leave Jack at $300. And I've made Jill better off without making Jack worse off. So we're moving to a more Pareto efficient allocation. You can make one person, the definition there is that you can make one person better off without making the other person worse off. You can move to a more Pareto efficient allocation. And even there, at the allocation 300 to Jack and 600 to Jill, we could still move towards a more Pareto efficient allocation. We could give perhaps increase Jack's allocation to 400 and leave Jill at 600, which would put us at a better position than we had before. And so at that point, we've reached a Pareto efficient allocation. There's no way we can make either one of those individuals better off unless we take away from one person and give to the other. We've reached a Pareto efficient allocation in that instance. In other words, we had $1,000 to allocate, and we've allocated it 400 to Jack and 600 to Jill. So that's sort of a basic idea around the notion of Pareto efficiency. It can get much more complicated in the way of graphing these allocations. Economists will be into the task of graphing these allocations as such, but that's sort of just an intuitive notion of what we mean by Pareto efficiency under the modern approach, which has its roots in utilitarian thinking. And so we'll stop there for this first lecture.